Welcome back to the next episode of Compliance Rundown with Loan Risk Advisors. I am Ray Steichwell, and today we have Champ Farrar with us to talk about marketing. Champ's background is pretty much marketing compliance, but we specifically want to talk about the use of team names in the mortgage space, particularly when loan officers want to operate in a name besides their first and last name. So there are some tricks and tips to that. And it does trigger possibly some regulatory issues and risk. And so we thought it was worthy to talk about it. So Champ, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
So let's lead into this. So talk to me about team names.
Yeah, I say it's I think it could be a more complicated issue than most people think. There's a whole lot that goes into it, not just compliance wise, but operationally and administratively and everything. It's a whole gamut of issues you can run into if you're not careful. So I think it's a great conversation to have. So, I guess my first thought is kind of defining like what is a team name, team name, otherwise known as maybe a vanity name. Some people may call it. We always call it team names, but you have the basic name nomenclature would be, first name, last name, team, or first name, last name, group. And it's better from a compliance standpoint to keep it pretty tight like that. You could do surname, team, surname, group, but you start to stray outside of name and team and name and group, then you start getting into names that aren't consistent with the person's licensing. And that's where you can get into some other regulatory issues, because you're saying, I want a team name, but I want it to be the, Empower Finance, and not even have team on there. And so that, what is that? What is Empower Finance? That sounds like a different company. And so that's not a team name at all. That's actually just what would be a DBA if you were to register it, but you're saying you don't want to register it. So it's that's where, okay, you're really stuck on this Power Finance. This is your brand. Maybe you brought with you. So if you really want this, we're going to have to register it as a DBA. Otherwise, we will get in trouble. And then the DBA question opens up a whole other can of worms, as you know.
Right. And really, setting the table here, the threshold issue is when you get a license. So let's say you have a mortgage lender license in a state, you are allowed to operate in that state with that license only under the name that appears on the license. That's generally the rule. So using your example of Empower in Finance, if that's not the company name that was registered, you're going to have to register it as a DBA, right?
Correct.
Right.
Yep.
Now, let me ask you this. If I were to call it the Empower Loan Team or Empower Team, would that be something you think might trigger a DBA?
Yeah, I think, team obviously adds a little different element to it, because it implies that you would think of it as a team within the company. And if you're having that conversation with that loan officer, that's where things may get a little bit tricky, because they have an argument to say, well, we're just a team within the company and we're locking it up with the company's logo. So what's the difference? Come on. But it's still the regulators would still take issue, because you're not following the letter of the law, advertising a name that's not registered. And also you might be confusing to the consumer. Well, is my mortgage company XYZ Mortgage, or is it the Empower Team? What is it?
Right. Okay, so let me ask you this. If I were the John Smith Team, would that be less of a problem?
Yeah, so that's where all the states have various laws that touch on this, and it's mostly around the licensing aspect of if you need to operate under your license name and advertise under your license name. So that's why, John Smith Team, that is your license name, and you're just adding team to it. For most of the states, they're pretty lax on the guidelines, and they don't care, and they'll allow it, and team names are fine. There's, I would say, a subset of states that are very strict. Though team names can be done, but they have to be within very certain parameters, and every state's different. So when I did this before, we had a big database of these states right here. It has to be John Smith Team or Smith Team, and then these states here, you are a little more loose. You could be John Smith Loan Team or the Smith Loan Team or Smith Group. And then there was another set of states that were so strict about it that it had to literally be first name, last name, and you put team on it, and they have a problem with it. And so we wouldn't allow team names there because it would cause a regulatory issue.
So your answer in all of those is it depends, meaning we can't make assumptions of what's going to happen in each state. So I submit that any loan officer, anybody who wants to do this, needs to check with legal and compliance to see if there's going to be an issue in a particular state. So now let me ask you this, the potential regulatory issues that come about this, we'll see it probably in state examinations, that kind of thing. But even then, I think managing might be tough. What are your thoughts on that?
It's one of those things that if you take care to manage it well up front and set clear and consistent guidelines and manage the assets and monitor to a point, you'll thank your future self will thank you Because if you don't do that, you're going to create a whole lot of headaches. And, one headache might be that you're very loose with your guidelines and you let people have whatever team names they want. And then down the road, maybe you have some regulatory issues come up with the state in an exam, and they say, well, why do you have all these loan officers advertising under names that aren't themselves? And then you have to crack down there, because if don't, you get in trouble. Well, now you onboard a new loan officer and they see that some loan officers still have this team name, and you're saying, we can't do that anymore because we got in trouble. And you're saying, well, he still has this name, why can't I? And that's a conversation you don't want to have. And then if you have a bunch of team names out there with a bunch of LOs, and let's say they're only licensed in Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and you say, okay, team name, the Smith loan team is great. And then a year goes by and that loan officer decides, I'm going to go add a license in Georgia and Vermont. And then Georgia and Vermont are very strict with team names, and you don't even know, your compliance team doesn't even know that they added those licenses. And sure enough, then here comes Georgia on an exam. They see them advertising with the team name, and you've got issues. So you got to have controls in place to make sure you catch that when they add those new licenses, so you stop it in its tracks.
Yeah, I also noticed sometimes that there would be the way to catch this. Again, this expectation is that this is just marketing and isn't a legal or regulatory issue. And of course, as we're talking about it, it is. And then it expands that often that they're using the Empower, I think is the example of Empower Finance or whatever. They're using that as on their own website, right? And then pushing it in social media, where that's a whole other issue. That's a whole other podcast about, monitoring for websites and social media. And so now it really kind of exacerbates the problem, because people are just thinking, well, I'm just pushing for the business, but it's like, you're perpetuating the problem even greater. So that's what I think.
That's a great point that you brought up. So if, I've had this objection come up a lot, and this is kind of a trap. So you say, well, okay, I'm licensed in Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana, and I'm adding Georgia, but I'm not going to advertise my team name in Georgia. It's just going to be in these states, and Georgia will advertise my name. That's fine in theory, but anything you put online you can't post something online and not make it be seen in Georgia. It's just not really possible. At least I don't think. So how do you fight against that? And they say, well, okay, well, just my stuff online will be targeted specifically. It's just, with a regulator, that's not going to fly. It's going to be too much trouble. The best thing to do there is either don't add the Georgia license. How important is Georgia to you? Are you going to do one loan a month? Or are you going to do 20? If you're going to do 20 loans, then maybe the team name's not as important, or you can look at doing the DBA route if it's available.
Okay, so let me ask you this, and as we close it out, what do you recommend a company do if they're going to allow team names?
I think it depends on the company. Some companies, the compliance culture is stronger than others. Some companies is very rigid, and that's expected, and you can get away with just having, okay, it's going to be first name, last name, and that's it. And that's great if you can do that. Other companies, that's not the case. The compliance culture is good, but maybe there's a little more leeway there. And every company is different. They got to find their balance. It depends on their risk tolerance. I'd say if you have that rigid thing, and it's a competitive market out there for loan officers, you have a top producing branch coming in, and they don't get the name they want, you could lose them over this. That happens. So I think you have to, if you want to be a little more loose with this, you come up with some just different layers of guidance. So what states are you licensed in? What licenses might you add later? And we can allow you to have this. Maybe it's an exception, and maybe it has to go up to the C-suite leadership to make that exception. Just make sure it's upfront and it's consistent, so that your recruiters and your onboarding aren't telling people one thing, what they want to hear, and then when it comes to marketing, get to do it, and it checks with compliance. Now marketing and compliance is the bad guy, and then it's a problem, and the LO is mad. You don't want to go that route.
Right. Fair. So let me sum up what I'm hearing then. So first of all, using an alternative name, whether it's even if it's a John Smith team or the Empower, loan team or whatever, could possibly be a regulatory issue. So go check with your compliance professional or legal department, whichever it is, to make sure that you're doing everything correct for the state that you're in. So that's what I'm hearing, first of all. Second of all, I'm hearing that, okay, if you're looking between alternative names, it seems to be easier to use something like the John Smith team versus the Empower loan team. In other words, using the first and last name of the loan officer to create the team. That seems to be the umbrella, so that makes sense. If you're going to allow it, kind of operationalize it well, so that, as you mentioned, as you go into other states, And, because you were fine, we do this often in compliance, state compliance anyway. We were fine in those 3 states that you did this, but you added another state we didn't know, that becomes the issue. So maybe have controls for that as well. I would add to that and see what you think. I would add to that make sure that the name is probably tasteful as well, right? So it's got to represent you well. I've heard names that were not a good idea. Maybe loan shark's not a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, that might be one of the more fun things about this conversation is some of the names I've come across, maybe not necessarily where I've worked, but just out in the space. You go online and you see somebody advertising and maybe for different companies and maybe some that slipped through with your own company. I don't know, but like, I feel like I've seen at least 2 or 3 versions of the Lone Ranger at various companies. I think there's always one that at least wants to do that.
That's funny.
And then I see like the king of mortgage, the queen of mortgage, the mortgage guru, and things that generally, from a compliance standpoint, you're advertising yourself as a guru. That might not be the best idea. It's like saying compliance never likes the word expert. So if your
Right.
team name is the mortgage expert, that's like, and you've been on LO for how many years? 2 years. So there's just considerations with everything.
Well, thanks, Champ, for your information on marketing compliance, particularly on team names. I think it's been very helpful for people, particularly the key tips of how to manage it correctly, know what you have an issue, manage it correctly, and you'll sleep better at night if you ask me. So thank you again for doing that. Thank you, everyone, for watching this episode of Loan Risk Advisors Compliance Rundown, and I hope to see you in the next episode.